On the afternoon of October 16th, 2020, a 47-year-old history and geography teacher named Samuel Paty left the Bois d'Aulnay Middle School in Conflans-Saint-Honorine, a quiet suburb 18 miles northwest of Paris. Waiting for him on a residential street was Abdullah Anzarov, an 18-year-old refugee of Chechen origin who had never been Paty's student. Anzarov attacked him with a 12-inch knife, beheaded him, and posted a photograph of the severed head to Twitter within the hour, captioned with a threat against President Emmanuel Macron. Police shot Anzarov dead 9 minutes after he was located, less than a mile from the scene. Paty's crime, in the eyes of his killer, had been pedagogical. Days earlier, in a class on freedom of expression, he had shown 2 Charlie Hebdo cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, first offering Muslim students the chance to look away. He had taught the same lesson for years without incident. But a parent at the school, Brahim Chnina, filmed a video denouncing Paty online, naming the school and its address, and an Islamist activist named Abdelhakim Sefrioui amplified the campaign. Investigators later concluded the video reached Anzarov, more than 60 miles away in Evro, within days, and he acted on it within 2 weeks of the original lesson. The killing landed in a France already primed for confrontation. 5 years after the Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan attacks, and 11 months after Macron had first floated tightening state oversight of Islamic organizations, Paty's death supplied the political shock the government needed to move. Within days, the Interior Ministry dissolved organizations linked to the campaign against him and opened dozens of investigations into associations accused of espousing similar ideology. Macron called it an attack on the Republic itself and vowed a law with teeth. What followed was not a one-off security response, but the foundation of the most sweeping legislative campaign against religious extremism France had mounted in decades, one that would reach into mosque financing, school choice, and the legal status of hundreds of associations. To understand how a single killing produced that machinery, the story has to go back over a century, to the law that gave the French state its claim to police religion in the first place. The word laicite did not begin with Islam. It began on December 9th, 1905, when the French Third Republic passed the law on the separation of church and state, formally ending the Catholic Church's status as an arm of government. For over a century before that date, France had paid the salaries of priests, funded church buildings, and let bishops sit near the levers of state power. The 1905 law tore that structure out. Article 2 declared flatly that the Republic does not recognize, pay, or subsidize any religion. Religion became a private matter. The state became officially blind to belief. The law was a bruising political fight, not a tidy compromise. Catholic clergy denounced it from the pulpit. Some parishes barricaded their doors against government inventories of church property, and Pope Pius X condemned the law outright in 1906. Yet within a generation, laicite had hardened into something closer to a civic religion of its own. A founding pillar of French identity, taught in every school, invoked in every court case about religious symbols in public life, from crucifixes in classrooms to, decades later, headscarves. For most of the 20th century, laicite's target was implicitly Catholic, because Catholicism was the dominant faith the framers had in mind when they wrote the state out of religious affairs. Islam barely registered in 1905. France's Muslim population was concentrated in colonial territories, not the metropole. That began changing after Algerian independence in 1962 and the labor migrations of the 1960s and 1970s, which brought millions of Muslim families to French cities. By the time headscarf bans reached French courts in the 1990s and 2000s, laicite had quietly become the legal vocabulary through which France argued about Islam specifically. That is the paradox at the center of this film. A law built to cage the political power of the Catholic Church has become, more than 100 years later, the primary legal weapon against Islamist extremism. When President Emmanuel Macron stood before cameras in October 2020 to announce his crackdown, he did not invent new legal ground. He reached for the oldest tool in the French Republic's kit and pointed it in a direction its authors never anticipated. 2 weeks before Samuel Paty was killed, on October 2nd, 2020, President Emmanuel Macron stood in Les Mureaux, a working-class suburb 25 miles west of Paris, where roughly a third of residents are Muslim, and delivered one of the most confrontational speeches of his presidency. Islam, he said, is a religion in crisis worldwide, and France had allowed a counter-society to take root within it, a network of associations, schools, and sports clubs that he argued was quietly replacing French law and French values with a parallel separatist order. He announced a bill to attack what he named Islamist separatism directly. Macron was careful, almost surgical, about where he drew the line. The target, he insisted, was never the roughly 6 million Muslims living in France, nor Islam as a faith practiced privately. The target was a political project, an ideology, in his words, that used religion as a lever to reject the Republic's authority, its courts, its schools, its equality laws, its secular classrooms. He cited forced marriages, virginity certificates, and gender-segregated swimming sessions as symptoms of a broader retreat from shared civic life, evidence that some communities were opting out of France rather than integrating into it. Critics heard something different. Muslim advocacy groups, opposition politicians on the left, and international human rights observers argued that the speech blurred exactly the line Macron claimed to be drawing, that separatism, as a legal category, was vague enough to sweep up ordinary religious practice alongside genuine extremism, and that a president campaigning ahead of a 2022 election already shadowed by the far-right national. Rally had chosen to fight on Marine Le Pen's rhetorical turf. Macron rejected the charge, but he did not walk back the framing. The Les Mureaux speech was a declaration of intent, not a law. It named the enemy and set the terms of the coming fight, but it left the actual machinery, the powers of dissolution, the financial controls, the oversight of mosques and schools, to be written afterward. Patty's murder, 16 days later, would supply the urgency to write it fast. 10 months after Macron's Les Mureaux speech and 9 months after Samuel Paty's murder, the French Parliament passed Law No. 2021-1109 on August 24, 2021, officially the law reinforcing respect for the principles of the Republic, known simply as the Separatism Law. It was the legislative machinery Macron had promised, and it reached deeper into civil society than any French law on religion in a century. The law's centerpiece is the Contrat d'Engagement Républicain, the Republican Commitment Contract. Any association seeking public funding above roughly 153,000 euros, and every association applying for official recognition, must now sign a pledge not to challenge the laws of the Republic, not to promote hatred or discrimination, and not to pressure others into violating French law on religious grounds. Refuse to sign or violate the pledge afterward, and public subsidies stop. It applies to youth clubs, sports federations, and cultural associations alike, not religious groups exclusively, but religious associations, and Muslim organizations above all, are its most scrutinized target. The law also hands the Interior Ministry sweeping new administrative powers. It can dissolve an association by government decree, without a prior criminal conviction, if officials judge it a threat to public order or Republican values, a power previously used sparingly, now formalized and expanded. It imposes tighter oversight of religious schools, requiring prior authorization rather than simple declaration for new institutions. And it moves decisively against home education. After years in which French law loosely tolerated homeschooling, the 2021 law makes it exceptional, requiring families to obtain state authorization rather than merely notify authorities, a provision aimed squarely at fears that home instruction was being used to shield children from secular curricula. Supporters called the law a necessary hardening of the Republic's defenses. Critics called it a blank check for administrative overreach, since dissolution now happens by ministerial decision first and judicial review only afterward. Nowhere would that tension play out more visibly than inside France's roughly 2,600 mosques, where the law's financial and oversight provisions were about to be tested in the buildings where Friday prayers are said. France counts roughly 2,600 mosques and prayer halls, from converted storefronts in industrial suburbs to purpose-built domes in Paris and Lyon, serving a Muslim population estimated at 6 million people, the largest in Western Europe. Since 2018, Well before the Separatism Law existed, the Interior Ministry had already begun closing or investigating dozens of these sites over allegations of extremist preaching, among them prayer halls near Béziers in the south and Grande-Synthe on the northern coast near Dunkirk, both shuttered after officials publicly cited specific sermons judged to incite hatred or openly glorify violence. The 2021 law gave that campaign a legal backbone and a new architect, Interior Minister Gerald Darmanin, who made mosque oversight a personal crusade. Under his Charter of Republican Principles, drafted with the newly created National Muslim Council, every imam preaching in France was ordered to sign a pledge renouncing foreign political interference and affirming loyalty to French law over any competing religious authority. Mosques that refused to align with the charter risked losing recognition, funding eligibility, or, in the most serious cases, closure under the same dissolution powers used against associations. Behind the charter sat a deeper problem Darmanin was trying to solve. France had almost no institution of its own for training imams. For decades, French mosques imported clergy trained abroad, fluent in classical Arabic or Turkish, but often unfamiliar with French law, language, and civic norms. In 2021, France opened its first state-linked imam training program, hosted not at a mosque, but at the Catholic Institute of Paris, a Catholic theological university lending its classrooms to train Muslim religious leaders in French secularism, a striking image of laicite's supposed neutrality in practice. The oversight campaign answered one question and immediately raised another. If French imams were going to be trained, vetted, and charter-bound at home, what would happen to the money and the men still arriving from abroad? For decades, the real power behind many French mosques had not really sat in Paris at all. It had sat instead in Algiers, Rabat, and Ankara. For decades, imams preaching in French mosques answered to foreign capitals, not French congregations. Algeria funded and staffed mosques serving its diaspora. Morocco's Ministry of Islamic Affairs dispatched clerics through the Mohammed VI Foundation. Turkey's Diyanet, its state religious authority, paid salaries and set sermons for hundreds of mosques tied to Turkish immigrant communities across France. By some counts, foreign governments and organizations funded or staffed close to 300 of France's mosques, embedding 4 foreign states' religious doctrine inside institutions meant to serve French citizens. Officials in Paris saw more than piety in these arrangements. A sermon written in Ankara or Rabat, they argued, could carry political loyalties incompatible with French citizenship, loyalties to a foreign government or monarchy, rather than to the Republic. The August 2021 Separatism Law moved to sever that dependency outright. It banned religious associations from accepting most foreign financing above a set threshold, and it barred foreign governments from paying imam salaries, training clergy abroad at state expense, or funding mosque construction without declared, vetted sources. The change forced a reckoning few had prepared for. France's roughly 6 million Muslims, Europe's largest Muslim population, would now have to fund their own clergy, training, and mosque upkeep domestically, largely for the first time in generations. The Foundation for Islam of France, created in 2016 to raise halal certification and pilgrimage tax revenue for exactly this purpose, had collected only a fraction of what full domestic funding would require. Building enough seminaries, certifying enough theologians, and paying enough salaries domestically was a decades-long undertaking, not a one-year fix. Imam training programs like the one launched at the Catholic Institute of Paris could seat dozens of students, not the thousands needed to replace foreign-trained clergy nationwide. The funding ban did not just starve foreign influence, it starved some organizations outright. Associations that could not prove clean financing, or whose leadership the Interior Ministry judged too close to banned ideologies, found themselves not merely underfunded, but formally dissolved by decree. The first of those dissolutions had already begun a year earlier, before the ink on the law was even dry. On October 28, 2020, the French Council of Ministers dissolved Baraka City, a Muslim humanitarian charity founded in 2010 that had raised millions of euros for relief work in Yemen, Syria, and Gaza. Interior Minister Gerald Darmanin accused its founder, Idriss Sihamady, of promoting a hateful, anti-Republican ideology through social media posts. Si Hamidi fled to Algeria rather than face prosecution. No French court had convicted Baraka City or Si Hamidi of any crime. The dissolution was an executive act, ordered by decree under the Code of Internal Security. Its bank accounts were frozen the same day, halting active aid shipments already staged for departure to Beirut following the port explosion 2 months earlier. 3 weeks later, on November 25, 2020, the government dissolved a second, larger target. The Collective Against Islamophobia in France, CCIF, the country's most prominent Muslim civil rights watchdog. Officials accused CCIF, which had documented thousands of discrimination complaints since 2003 and operated on an annual budget of roughly 700,000 euros, drawn mostly from small member donations, of stoking a narrative of Muslim victimhood that fed the same separatist ideology blamed for Samuel Paty's murder. Again, no criminal conviction preceded the order. CCIF's leadership called the move a political liquidation of the group best positioned to challenge the state in court. Rather than fight the dissolution inside France, CCIF's founders relocated across the border to Brussels within weeks and re-registered under a new name, continuing much of the same casework from Belgian soil. French officials called the maneuver proof of the very evasion the law was written to stop. Proof the group had never truly disbanded, only relabeled itself beyond French jurisdiction. Amnesty International and several UN rapporteurs read it the opposite way, as evidence that dissolution without trial pushes legitimate advocacy underground or abroad rather than resolving it. Both readings would soon collide in Geneva and Paris, where international bodies began asking a harder question. Not whether France could dissolve an association by decree, but whether it should be allowed to, without a judge weighing in first. The confrontation was no longer just a French argument about one law. It was about to become a question posed directly to Paris by Geneva itself. In February 2021, as the Separatism Law moved through the French Senate, United Nations human rights experts issued a formal warning to Paris. The law, they wrote, granted the executive branch power to dissolve associations by administrative decree, a decision made by ministers, not judges, with no requirement for prior judicial review before an organization's assets were frozen and its activities criminalized. Amnesty International went further, calling the dissolution power a serious risk to freedom of association and expression, and warning that vague terms like hatred, violence, or discrimination left enormous discretion in ministerial hands. Critics called it a blank check dressed up as public order. The core objection was procedural, not just ideological. French law lets the state act first and lets courts review later. A group can be dissolved on a Wednesday, its bank accounts frozen, and its members barred from reforming similar organizations, and only afterward can it petition the Council of State, France's highest administrative court, to overturn the decision. By the time a judge rules, often a year or more later, the organization has typically ceased to exist in practice. French officials rejected the premise that this made the process lawless. Justice Ministry figures showed that more than a dozen dissolution orders issued since 2020, including challenges from Baraka City and CCIF, had been formally reviewed by the Council of State, which upheld most, but not all of them, modifying or annulling a handful over insufficient evidence. Judicial review exists, officials insisted. It simply comes after the state acts, not before, a sequencing they defended as necessary to stop radicalization rather than let it continue through years of litigation. The dispute exposed a genuine fault line, not just a French one. How much due process should a liberal democracy suspend to defend itself from ideologies that reject liberal democracy altogether? France had answered that question one way. The next question was whether any other European country, with its own constitution and its own history, could answer it the same way, or whether France's model would turn out to be one nobody else could legally copy. Austria moved first, and moved hard. Its 2015 Islam law, passed years before Emmanuel Macron's Les Moreau speech, banned foreign funding of Muslim organizations outright and required mosques to register formally with the state. In June 2018, Vienna acted on that law's teeth. It shut 7 mosques linked to Turkish and Arab associations and ordered the expulsion of around 60 imams whose salaries traced back to foreign governments, mostly Turkey. Ankara called it a hostile, Islamophobic provocation. Austrian officials called it enforcement of a decade-old statute nobody had tested at scale before. But Austria's law rests on an unusual foundation few other states share. A 1912 Islam law originally passed to manage Bosnian Muslim soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian army, later repurposed as sweeping state authority over religious organization. France's 1905 laicite framework is different in kind, a total wall between state and religion, applied in theory equally to Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, and Islam alike. Neither model exists in Germany or Belgium. Germany's basic law explicitly protects religious communities' self-governance and grants recognized faiths corporate status with tax collection powers, the opposite of a strict separation wall. Berlin has moved against individual mosques and preachers case by case, banning a handful of associations tied to militant financing, but nothing resembling France's blanket foreign funding ban has cleared Germany's constitutional courts, which guard religious liberty closely. Belgium, its state fractured across 3 linguistic regions, has debated its own imam law for years without passing one, wary of reigniting communal tensions in Brussels and Antwerp. What France built after Samuel Paty's murder is real. A working legal architecture that closed mosques, dissolved associations, cut foreign financing, and forced 6 million Muslims to fund their own clergy, all while surviving review at the Council of State and criticism from Geneva. Whether Vienna's harder edge, Berlin's constitutional caution, or Brussels' paralysis becomes Europe's future remains genuinely open. France proved a secular state can draw a hard line against religious extremism and hold it. It has not proven that any other democracy, with its own constitution and its own history, can draw that line in the same place. For now, France stands as a red line, not yet a blue line.